There has in the last decade or so been quite a bit of bickering and confusion over how to properly define and use the terms atheist and agnostic. Now, if you've ever watched a video on this topic, you've probably heard something like this.
It's because he doesn't understand what atheism is.
If you put A in front of theist, it means you are not a theist, you are not religious. Whenever you put A in front of Gnostic, that means Gnostic means knowledge, so that means you don't have knowledge of whatever you're talking about. In this case, it's referring to religion or whether or not there's a God. So whenever you say you're agnostic about whether or not there's a God, that's not a position of belief, that's a position of knowledge that...
Therefore, I'm an agnostic atheist when it comes to the position on knowledge and belief regarding a God. I don't know if a God exists, and I lack a belief in one.
Atheists asserting that the definition of the term atheism is merely a lack of belief in God and not necessarily a claim to the contrary that God or gods do not exist. The word Gnostic, they say, means knowledge as distinct from belief, which in this context makes it basically just a synonym for certainty, and agnostic, likewise, a synonym for uncertainty. This is in contrast to how the words were commonly defined until then, that atheism is a belief that God does not exist, and the word agnostic is actually the proper term for someone who is non-committal either way, who neither believes that God exists nor believes that no God exists. So you will hear theists and self-described agnostics claiming that certain atheists are really agnostics.
Answer? Yes. Therefore, sir, I would suggest you're not an atheist, you're an agnostic.
And you'll hear some atheists saying that self-described agnostics are actually really atheists.
You agnostics are just atheists who don't know it, okay?
If you identify yourself strictly as an agnostic, stop. You are misusing the term because it's not a neutral position between atheism and theism.
You'll also hear that the words Gnostic and agnostic refer to what you know, and theist, atheist refer to what you believe, and thus you can be an agnostic atheist or an agnostic theist. They may even go so far as to accuse self-identified agnostics of being cowardly, too afraid to identify with the label atheist due to some perceived negative connotations or potential social difficulties that may ensue. So who's correct? What are the proper definitions? Often those in support of the lack of belief definition will appeal to the etymology. Well, technically, etymology includes historical usage, and historical usage actually affirms the alternative definition. So specifically, they just analyze the root word and prefix, going back to the ancient Greek or Latin. Now, I have some problems with this concerning the definition of both terms. They're correct regarding the "a" prefix, though to be more accurate, it doesn't strictly mean without. More broadly, it's just a negation, meaning no or not, but without works well enough in this case. What does not work is completely ignoring the suffix ism. Atheism doesn't simply mean without God, because theism doesn't simply mean God. You don't pray to theism, you pray to theos. Theos means God. The suffix ism is technically defined as either a state condition or, most relevant in this context, a doctrine. And a doctrine is something you believe in or not. So theism means the God doctrine, or to put it even more clearly, God belief. Atheism, then, is no God belief. Unfortunately, this doesn't settle the matter either. It's still ambiguous, and particularly astute listeners will be able to pick up on that simply by listening to the different ways I emphasize the words. The definition of atheism, on the one hand, could be no God belief, or no God belief. But as you've heard in the clips I've shown you, oh, you haven't actually seen all those clips yet, huh? Hey, editor, future me that's editing this video, show him the clips. Come on. Man. Oh, what's up with that guy? Can't always count on him.
Agnosticism, to not know, or Gnosticism, to know, is a statement of what you claim to know on a given subject matter. Atheism, disbelief, and theism, belief, is a statement of what you claim to believe in regards to the existence of a God. A person can be an agnostic atheist or Gnostic atheist, or an agnostic theist or Gnostic theist.
To put it clearly, theism and atheism address what you believe, while Gnosticism and agnosticism address what you assert to know. And so if I ask you, do you believe in a God, and your answer is no, then you're an atheist. And if your answer is, as is the case with yourself, I don't know, then you haven't answered my question. You either believe or you do not believe. That is, you're either a theist or an atheist. And how certain you are of your belief, that is, how Gnostic or agnostic you are, is a completely different question.
Well, my good man, while your British accent is very, very convincing, could it just be that they define the words differently? So maybe they are answering the question, they're just using terms in a different way than you are? Nah, I'm sorry, I'm just teasing with you, you know, it's a lovely accent, and the British, you know, you're fine people. You really are. I have a lot of respect for the British. And you know, it's to be fair, I mean, British accents, unless it's Cockney accent, you know, are very persuasive. You know, just by itself, just an accent. That's all you need, and you know, it's like you're halfway there to convincing someone you know what you're talking about. Again, they appeal to the root words in Greek to support this usage. One big problem that I have here is that by now, Gnosis already has a very long history of being used in reference to a very particular sort of knowledge that is spiritual in nature. In fact, various groups of believers on the religious fringes, so to speak, groups of occultists, ecstatics, and mystics spanning the last 2,000 years have been recognized as Gnostic in character. So to have this gnosis is to have a mystical experience or revelation, more or less. This gnosis is not something you get communicated to you through words, nor is it arrived at through inference or induction. Gnosis is a direct experience of the divine in some capacity. Now, I don't know about you, but I have a hard time ignoring all that in order to use the word now as a mere synonym for certainty. And it really sounds weird to me, as someone who has read about the Gnostics and has used the term in that sense for quite a while, to now hear the word Gnostic coupled with atheist, to be a Gnostic atheist, it sounds like a contradiction in terms because of the way the word has been used up to now. Now, besides all that, I think it's worth pointing out as well that etymology and the dictionary is not prescriptive unless you want it to be. The authors of dictionaries are not the sole individuals with power to decide how a word is used. On the contrary, dictionaries reflect usage. Words can and have been redefined. Their meanings have changed over time and in different places. If enough people begin to use an alternative definition of some word for a long enough time, the dictionary will eventually reflect that and change their printed definition, or at least supplement it with the new one. So it's really on us to decide and come to a consensus on how we'll define these terms. Now, if you've ever seen videos on this topic, you've probably come across displays like these. Using agnostic as a synonym for certainty, it's then coupled with the terms atheist and theist as a modifier on those terms, and likewise for the word Gnostic. So you end up with 4 positions: Gnostic atheist and Gnostic theist, agnostic atheist and agnostic theist. Now the problem is that there are actually 5 relevant positions, not 4, or technically speaking 4 positions and 1 non-position. I suppose maybe the best way to say it would be there are 5 possible responses one can give, 4 of those being these positions, and 1 of those being the refusal to take a position. So let's go ahead and plug in the definitions to these terms. A Gnostic theist is someone who believes that God exists, that's the theist part, and they are certain of that belief, that's the Gnostic part. An agnostic theist is someone who is uncertain of their belief that God exists. So they do believe God exists, but not with complete certainty. They admit they could be wrong or have doubts. Now, a Gnostic atheist, well, now we have a problem, because if Gnostic is merely a synonym for certainty, and atheism is merely a lack of belief in the proposition that God exists, then these words can't coherently be used in conjunction with each other. If we did, and we plugged in those definitions, we get a Gnostic atheist is someone who knows that they lack belief that God exists. Likewise, an agnostic atheist is someone who doesn't know or is uncertain of their lack of belief that God exists. Or, put another way, they're uncertain whether they don't believe that God exists. It doesn't really make much sense. It's silly, and perhaps, if not incoherent, it's at least rather silly. So in order to use these words together, we have to understand atheism as expressing the proposition that no God exists, or that God does not exist, rather than mere lack of belief. Then we can make sense out of it. So using that definition, Gnostic atheist would be someone who believes that no God exists and is certain of that belief. An agnostic atheist would be someone who believes that God does not exist, but is not completely sure about it, isn't certain. They don't know it, or they don't believe it with certainty. But what term shall we use to represent someone who takes no position either way? We can't use atheism, defined ambiguously as either lack of belief or belief no God exists, because the very purpose here is to distinguish the two, and that is the problem I alluded to before that I have with giving atheism this ambiguous definition. Not to mention, we've already had to exclude the lack of belief part from the definition in order to use it in conjunction with the terms Gnostic and agnostic. So I suppose if you really wanted, you could use the word atheist to represent the neutral position using the word by itself, but that's just muddled. Then you'd have the same word denoting two distinct positions, it would represent the lack of belief either way position or response when used alone, and it would represent the belief that no God exists position when used in conjunction with the words Gnostic or agnostic. And as I said, I think that's muddled and confused, or at least it'll cause confusion. I think it already has. So if it is causing all this confusion, what's the point? Why go to all this trouble to try to redefine these words? And it seems like the issue actually is something to do with burden of proof. So as soon as an atheist admits, oh, well, I do believe God doesn't exist, whether with certainty or not, the theist, at least in formal debates and such, and probably a lot of times in YouTube comments when they're going at each other, they'll say, oh, well, that's a claim, and you have a burden of proof. You have to try to prove this negative, which isn't necessarily impossible. I mean, it's probably impossible in broad terms, beyond the shadow of a doubt, but there are things you can bring up for that, but it seems like that was at least in part why this started to catch on, this definition of atheism as a lack of belief, as well as perhaps wanting to make atheism a bigger tent, so to speak. But more so, it seemed to catch on because of the former issue. The problem, though, like I said, was that once they redefined atheism to be lack of belief, either way, rather than a belief in no God, that's how people used the word agnostic formerly. So when they redefined atheism that way, then they had to redefine agnostic, and that led to redefining Gnostic. So kind of went one after the other there. And I do not like redefining Gnostic like that. So I would urge you to maybe settle upon some alternative terminology. Maybe go back to the way it was before, or at the very least, stop using agnostic and atheist and Gnostic and atheist in conjunction with each other. Use a weak and strong atheism, or soft and hard, or something like that. I would much prefer Gnostic to continue to be associated with gnosis, with the mystical experience of some sort. And I think that's when the word should be applied. So, maybe you can be a Gnostic atheist on second thought if you're someone who is an atheist but has had some mystical experience, like Sam Harris talks about, that these spiritual experiences aren't, you don't necessarily have to believe in anything supernatural or anything of that sort to still acknowledge and recognize the value and the power of mystical or spiritual experience. So let's just use the word in that sense. Please. I think that would be best. So that's about it. I hope you enjoyed watching the video. Hope it was informative and that I got my point across clearly. I know it's kind of a long video here. Hopefully in the future I'll be able to shorten things down a bit, maybe be a bit more succinct. I do plan on putting out some more videos in the near future, so be on the lookout for those. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. It'll give me some more motivation to put some more of these things out. Wow, ending this is way more difficult than I thought it would be. I've just gone through about 15 different farewells, kind of, till next time. Thanks again. See y'all later. Yeah, whatever. Get out of here.